Welcome to the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is episode 19, and today we have Dr. Douglas Casa, a professor at the University of Connecticut, joining us on the show. Dr. Casa is a thermoregulation expert and the author of several books on athletic performance in the heat and how to prevent sudden death from sports-related traumas. Listen to this episode to learn how regulating your body temperature can help you become a faster cyclist. Dr. Douglas Casa, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. You are a professor at the University of Connecticut, right? In the kinesiology department?
I am, and I'm also CEO of the Corey Stringer Institute.
Awesome. And you're just finishing up the semester for Christmas break?
We are, yes. Just posted my grades today, actually.
Perfect. It must feel good, hey?
Yes.
I hope everyone passed.
They did, yes.
Oh, good. Even better.
Yeah.
All right. So we interviewed Dr. Robert Chapman in our last episode, and we talked about altitude training, and he was an absolutely invaluable resource on the topic. And we asked him, said that we wanted to do a topic on thermoregulation. And we said, who should we talk to? And he said, without a doubt, that you are the best in the country on the topic. So we are very, very happy to have you on the show today.
That's. I think I owe him a Christmas present.
Maybe that's what he was looking for.
Yes.
Anyway, I know we have about an hour of your time today, and we could talk a lot about your background and stuff. But I really want to get to the questions, so let's just jump right into it, so we can get a lot covered on the show.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Okay, so let's cover a few basics. I like to do quite a bit of research before these shows, but I want to make sure that I'm generally on the right page, and it helps get the listeners up to speed. So our bodies have a narrow internal temperature band that they have to maintain for us to survive. And from what I've read, that's about 95 degrees on the low end to 107 degrees Fahrenheit on the high end. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's mostly true. When you're up near 107, that could be the real potential for danger.
Right.
I think you probably say up to 105, where you're probably not in the danger zone yet. And for the exercising individual, you're probably between an even tighter range. It's probably somewhere between 101 and 105.
Okay. Okay, perfect. And if those temperatures are the extremes, what is the optimal temperature for human performance with athletics?
Oh, that's a good question. So optimal, ironically, is as low as you can be while still doing the exercise that you need to do. So my point here is, if something requires you to be at 103 degrees Fahrenheit and you have certain mitigation strategies that you could be at 102 instead, then that would be better.
Okay.
So the mitigation, could be things like body cooling or hydration, certain textiles or clothing you might wear. So the point is you perform better if your temperature is a little bit lower. So you're always trying to kind of limit the amount of hypothermia.
Okay, perfect.
Cool. How much does core body temperature affect performance?
That's a good question. So it has a huge impact on performance. So when your temperature starts to get up around 103.5 range and higher, you start to have something called volitional exhaustion, meaning that you start to not be able to go as hard because your body is now potentially moving into a protective mode where you don't want to get your body temperature too high because that could have potential risks associated with it. So thankfully, through an evolutionary perspective and something that's worked really well for hundreds of thousands of years, your body will obviously lower the intensity a little bit so you don't see the continued climb in the body temperature.
Okay.
So it's a bit protective. So if you can have strategies where you can still have the same level of intensity, but keeping the temperature, a little bit lower, obviously you're going to be able to keep that intensity going for a longer period of time.
Perfect. Okay. So just so our listeners have a bit of an understanding of how heat transfer works, John and I are both mechanical engineers, so we study this to death. But for those, heat moves from a warmer object to a colder object. So if you're outside and it's really, really cold, the heat will move from your body to the cold environment. And if it's really, really hot, the heat will move from the environment to your body. Okay. And heat transfer happens in a couple ways. You have conduction, which is basically two objects touching. So if a warm object and a cold object are in contact, the heat will transfer through the molecules to the colder object. You have convection, and a good way of thinking of that is moving air or fluid around it. So if you have a convection oven, the little fan kicks on and that helps cook things faster. So that's another way of moving heat. And then you have radiation, which comes from the sun. So the sun's rays radiate down on top of you. So knowing those basic concepts, let's get into, first we're going to talk about the heat first. So let's get into training and racing in the heat. And from my understanding, there are a few reasons why our body temperature will increase. And that's because the environment or the temperature outside is hot. And also because as we're training and racing, the muscular contractions in our body have a byproduct, and that is heat. Am I missing anything? Is there any other way that our body takes on heat?
So you're officially the person who's interviewed me in my life who's known the most about this to start out.
Yes.
So is it okay if I give you a little bit of an overview here?
Please do.
Yeah. So when I explain this to people to try to get them up to speed with understanding why these mitigation strategies in the heat really have a big impact on performance and health, I try to have them understand this. Generally speaking, your skin temperature, might be around 93, 94 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And your body temperature during intense exercise in the heat, let's just say, is around 102 to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So as you mentioned earlier, heat will go from the core of the body out to the skin surface area and generally, leaves your body because it's going from the higher temperature to the lower temperature.
Okay.
But during hard exercise, your skin temperature does gradually creep up from the resting of 93, 94 degrees. And as it gets closer to your body temperature, your core body temperature, then obviously it becomes harder to dissipate heat because there's less of a mechanism to diffuse that heat from the inside to the outside.
Okay.
So as you mentioned before, what's important about the skin temperature is if the environmental temperature outside is higher than the skin temperature, then you're actually absorbing heat from the environment via conduction, convection, and radiation.
Yeah. Right.
So then actually not only are you creating this massive amount of heat from the musculature and the exercise that you're doing, but you're also actually, the ancillary is you're actually gaining heat from the environment. You don't want to, but you are via conduction, convection, and radiation. So the worst case scenario, just as an example, think of the high school football player in Georgia in August.
Okay.
They're out there, it's 95, 96 degrees outside. It's warmer than their skin temperature. They're absorbing heat from the environment. So the only mechanism left that they have to cool themselves is evaporation. And that's when a sweat droplet evaporates into the air because there's a water vapor pressure gradient, meaning there's a gradient for that droplet to actually evaporate into the air. But the problem is, in my scenario, I just said it for the Georgia high school football player, is that it's often humid, very humid, exactly.
Yeah.
So if you have a very high humidity, that sweat droplet often does not evaporate and it just falls off of the skin and falls onto the ground. And that was a colossal waste from a physiological perspective because one, you got dehydrated, and two, it did not cool you at all because it just dropped and it didn't evaporate. So that's why it's really important to understand the relationship between your skin temperature and your core body temperature, and then how they relate to the environmental conditions, because the intensity of the activity and the environmental conditions are by far the two biggest factors that will dictate the rate of rise of body temperature during activity.
Okay. It's really interesting you say that. We studied in school or in mechanical engineering and thermodynamics, they'll talk about wet bulb versus dry bulb temperatures. Mm-hmm. And so dry bulb means there's essentially, you have very little humidity. Wet bulb is a high humidity. And the first time I really understood that was we grew up in the east coast of Canada. So in the summertime, it's very humid. Oh, yeah. You get out of the water and you're still sort of warm. Chris and I moved down to Las Vegas, in our early 20s, mm-hmm. and it would be 115 outside and you jump in a pool. And when you got out of the pool, because the humidity was so low, you'd be freezing, you'd be shivering because all of that evaporation is taking effect off of your skin and making you very cold. So that's
I just gave a presentation in Phoenix last year, and I had some people in the audience. One person in particular is like saying, do you think I should be worried because I do a lot of exercise, really hard endurance exercise outside in the heat, and I don't sweat at all? I said, do you really think you don't sweat? I said, you'd be dead pretty fast if you did really hard exercise and you didn't sweat. I said, the benefit you have of training in the Arizona area is that sweat droplet evaporates so fast that your shirt is still dry and you don't notice the sweat droplet. Yep. Where you could do that same thing, come to Gainesville, Florida in August, and your clothing could be 2, 3, 4 pounds just full of sweat when you're done.
Cool. So either we think alike, or I did my research well because you answered about 6 of my questions with right in a row. Yes. There, it was great.
Yeah, I did look at your questions; they were phenomenal.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so couple questions based on that. Since we know that we produce heat based on muscular contraction, do athletes with a higher muscle mass produce more heat than those who are smaller?
Okay. So say that one more time, because I actually just had another idea. Remind me to follow up with one thing I wanted to just explain from my previous conversation.
Of course. So muscular contraction causes heat, right? Mm-hmm. It's a byproduct of it. So if you have a marathon runner who's, very lean muscularly, and then you have a big football player, does the football player who has a bigger body mass and higher muscle mass produce more heat than the smaller athlete?
That's an awesome question. So this, like any great question, there's so many factors to consider there, and there's no simple answer.
Okay.
So the reason is that the super lean marathon runner can run so fast, and usually faster than other people. Like if he can run a 440 mile,
yep.
And generate and have such a high intensity versus a Joe Schmo person who's big might only run a 730 mile, right? So you have to look at what percent of their max are they able to hold during that particular setting. If people are running at the same percent of their max, then the amount of heat should be similar to the relative amount of mass that they have.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
So it's really interesting. Kind of sometimes when you look at the medical complications, it helps tell a story a little bit. In America, by far in athletic populations, there are 2 populations that are at over 95% of all exertional heat strokes when people get too hot. And those are the American football player and the distance runner. Okay, and so it's super interesting that it's those 2 sports. Out of the hundreds of sports, basically heat stroke is down to 2 things, and you would include like potentially triathlon in there because the heat stroke happens during the run. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they're endurance runners. And what's interesting there is that in the football scenario, it's usually the football player trying to keep up with their teammates and being driven by their coach and going at a pace that's beyond what they would do on their own. So a football player never has a heat stroke when they're just go out and condition on their own. You don't ever hear a football player, training by himself, he had a heat stroke.
Yeah.
So it happens always when there's other people around, because if he was left to his own volition and he would go at a pace that makes sense to him and know when to back off when he's not feeling well. But because he's, the peer pressure of either the teammates or the driving from the coaches, sometimes cause them to push beyond their own normal limits.
Yeah.
Whereas in a runner will drive themselves to that situation. But in the running, it happens in a race. In football, it happens in practice. Because in football games, there's enough natural recovery between plays, or if their offense is on the field and defense is off, you know what I mean? And there's enough natural recovery that you don't have enough time to generate the heat to have a heat stroke. So heat strokes never happen in football games. They happen in practices that don't have good models in terms of work to rest ratios.
Okay.
But in running, you actually don't see it in practices almost ever. And that's because the runner will back off when they're not feeling well. But when they're left to push themselves to maybe meet a Boston Marathon qualifying time, or push the last 2 miles to get a PR, or a friend joins them for the last 5 miles to pace them, and the friend is fresh and this person's exhausted. So you have the scenarios that in a race, the runner, will succumb to the heat stroke.
Okay, cool. Okay, before we jump into the next section, you wanted me to remind you to go back to another point. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I feel like it was the great question you had before, trying to understand. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of compensatory versus uncompensatory exercise or heat loss.
Okay.
And compensatory heat loss means that the amount of heat that you're able to lose in a given period of time, whether it be via conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation, is equal to the amount of heat that you're generating from that exercise session. So, but uncompensatory is where you run into the problems, is where the amount of heat that you're generating is a little bit higher than the amount of heat that you're losing. Now, that might be fine in a 5K or 10K race, because at the end you might be 104.2 or 103.7, and the race ends before it becomes dangerous. But if you might have a laborer or a warfighter or an athlete in a situation where they push, the uncompensatory pushes beyond the safety zone, and if you keep generating more heat than you're losing, you obviously could push yourself into a point of, being in a heat stroke. And that's a key part of understanding exertional heat stroke, is most people think it's a failure of the thermoregulatory system. And I always try to have people understand that it's actually an overwhelming of the thermoregulatory system. You're still sweating. You're still able to do exercise. It's just simply happening. You're generating heat at too fast of a rate.
Yeah, the input is greater than the output.
Exactly.
So, okay. All right. So we interviewed a sweat specialist on our show, months ago. And he talked a lot about it's kind of like a sweat fingerprint, if you will. And that what he's saying is that each athlete has a specific sweat rate and sodium concentration in that sweat rate. So if it's hotter or colder, obviously the sweat rate changes, but the concentration of sodium in their sweat will never change. Do you believe in that?
Okay. So do you remember who you interviewed?
Yeah, Daryl Griffiths from Australia. It's Shots Nutrition. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. So a few things to consider here. Another great line of discussion. So let's just start with sweat rate for a second.
Okay.
So the key things with sweat rate is there's 4 key factors that determine anybody's sweat rate. One is the size of the individual.
Yep.
Second is the environmental conditions. Third is the intensity of the activity. And fourth is their heat acclimatization status. Okay. So first one is their size. Obviously, bigger people have more surface area and they're going to sweat more for some given period at a similar relative intensity. Okay. So an offensive lineman in the NFL, honestly, they sweat sometimes 3.5 liters per hour, whereas an elite distance runner might be 1.5 or 2 liters per hour doing the same kind of percent max.
Okay.
Wow. Second is the environmental conditions. So obviously, higher wet bulb globe temperature is going to cause a higher sweat rate. Not surprisingly, if it's hotter out, you sweat more. Third is the intensity of the activity. If you're going harder, you sweat more because you're generating more heat in your musculature. You have to make more of an effort to cool yourself. Okay. And the fourth one is heat acclimatization, which is a good one to end on because of your sodium question. The more heat acclimatized you get, you actually increase your sweat rate after about 10 to 14 days of initial heat exposure. So the advantage there is that more sweat allows you to cool yourself more efficiently. Obviously, there's the massive caveat that if it's humid, that actually could be detrimental, right? Because now you actually dehydrate faster. But assuming most environmental conditions, that enhanced sweat rate increases your capacity for cooling.
Okay, so heavier sweaters then can cool themselves more effectively.
Okay, so you ask questions that have 2 answers. So in really humid conditions, that's not true because you actually dehydrate faster and you're not cooling effectively because the humidity does not evaporate. In most conditions, that is true, that more sweating will be allowed for more cooling.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So to get to your sodium question from before, I do believe we do know people's sweat sodium concentrations can change when they become heat acclimatized. One of the massive benefits of heat acclimatization is that you actually conserve your sodium, potassium, and other electrolytes as you get heat acclimatized. So after a couple weeks of exercise in the heat, you actually sweat a lot less sodium. So your body is super smart and holds on to the sodium. So even though you're increasing your sweat rate, your body's like, well, we're going to still hold on to this electrolytes and not sweat this out as much. So you actually conserve your sweat electrolytes. That's one of the physiological changes that happen with heat acclimatization.
So that's a contrast. Daryl said that never changes regardless of temperature, but you're saying you disagree with that. It changes.
So related to temperature, I think is true. Like if you just said, the amount of sodium per unit of sweat is like, if I just took you right now and put you in 50 degrees, 70 degrees, 90 degrees, and 110, I think that's true.
Okay.
But if I took you after 3 weeks of exercising, let's say I did 90 degrees today, and then I did 3 weeks of intense exercise in the heat, assuming you had not been heat exposed in these last, period of time, and then we would be able to decrease your sweat sodium because of heat acclimatization. Okay. I think his statement related to the temperature is true, but heat acclimatization is something different. And that's why people go to Kona when they do the Ironman World Championships. They go to Kona 3 weeks early because they might be coming from, Northern Hemisphere or different places of the world that is not super hot in October. And they want to get there and get the heat exposure because heat acclimatization, not just with sweat electrolyte conservation, you start sweating at a lower body temperature. You have a massive benefit of plasma volume expansion, which is this incredible ergogenic aid of that you have more plasma volume after you get heat acclimatized, which obviously keeps your heart rate a little bit lower.
Yep.
Because your stroke volume is a little bit higher. So there's a lot of benefits with heat acclimatization there. Okay. But to take it one step further, to follow up on that conversation you had before, it is true within comparing individuals to each other, sweat rates can be dramatically different. Like you could have an elite mountain biker have a sweat rate of 2 liters per hour, and you could have a person finish next to him in the race, and he could be 3 liters per hour, or he could be 1 liter per hour doing the same race in the same environmental conditions. Okay. So people can be different, and their sweat sodium concentrations certainly can be different compared between individuals, because we say some people are salty sweaters, versus not.
Yeah.
And that's why we do that testing here at the University of Connecticut at the Croix String Institute. We have some of the top triathletes and runners in the world fly to us to get their testing done, because we do the very rare testing called whole body washdown, which is the gold standard for sweat electrolyte concentrations, where people can we figure out their sweat rates for them, but we collect all of the sodium that they sweat during an exercise session. And then we actually can measure specifically the amount of sodium, potassium they sweat during a given unit of time. So we had a lot of people who raced in Kona this past year. They came to us beforehand. And we mimic the exact environmental conditions that we predict for Kona. We put them at the exact VO2 max on the bike and treadmill that they're going to be racing at. And then we figure out their sweat rates and their sweat electrolyte concentrations for that race. Yeah.
All right. We might have to come out and do that test.
Yeah. You're welcome to come. Yeah. You would have a blast. We have a lot of people have come out to experience that.
Okay, cool. Okay. So knowing that there's different sweat rates, you said a mountain biker can finish at 1 liter an hour to 3 liters an hour. If you are a heavy sweater and you know that, really what we're trying to do in long distance races is the stomach is only so big and the skin is this massive surface, and you're going to sweat more than your stomach can absorb. So if you know you're a heavy sweater, does it make sense to limit your racing? So instead of doing an 8-hour race where you're going to be behind, should you limit yourself to maybe a 4-hour race so you have a better chance of performing well?
That's a great question again. So the benefit of the 8-hour race, though, is your intensity is lower. And if the intensity is lower, you don't have as much blood shunting away from the stomach and the intestines. So you actually can handle a higher volume of fluid per unit of time. But if you want to go to averages, most people have theorized that we can handle 1 to 1.5 liters per hour in terms of gastric emptying, like moving the fluid from the stomach into the intestines and the intestines into the bloodstream. But obviously the math becomes difficult for us if your sweat rate's 2.5 liters per hour and you only can handle 1.5 liters per hour.
You already got a problem.
And you have a 4-hour race, you're a liter down per hour, that's 4 liters, and you weigh whatever, so you can start doing your calculations out what your percent dehydration is going to be at the end.
Okay.
So there's a lot of parts of that. So there's things, if you're a really high sweater, the things that we do with people with really high sweat rates is, one, make sure you start the race properly hydrated, right? So there's no need to have any additional deficit. Okay. Second, we do think you can train your gut to handle fluids. So you might be able to normally handle 0.8 liters per hour, but by working at it as another training strategy, you might be able to get to 1.4 liters per hour by drinking during training time and time again. Okay. So that could also help you. And then obviously, if you're a massively high sweater, you might be right. Your sweet spot for a race might be 2 or 3 hours. It might not be 6 or 7 hours.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So let's talk about keeping cool. What are some of the best techniques for athletes to keep cool? Is it like clothing, sponging, hydration, any specific gloves or helmets, gear? What do you think for tips for people to stay cool?
So that's good. So body cooling strategy. So one of the first things that's, I think, informative for people to understand is the most powerful thing you could ever do is anything that lowers the skin temperature is going to have a massive effect on cooling. So it brings us back to that, wanting to send heat from the inside to the outside. So if your skin temperature is creeping up during exercise, if you have mechanisms to cool your skin, so freezing cold water via towels or sponges or anything that you can introduce cold water to as much of the skin surface area as possible is going to be helpful.
Okay.
Obviously, in some endurance sports, it's more difficult versus you could picture a halftime in soccer, lacrosse, football is much easier than someone while they're doing the bike
marathon
section in Kona or something.
Yeah.
So, but you still can do things. You still can strategize. There might be things that you can do to put on your head or your hair or your neck or anything like that. Okay. So that's one item is for lowering skin surface temperature. Next is certainly hydration. Not to be overlooked, every additional 1% body mass loss causes about a 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit rise in your body temperature during intense exercise in the heat. That doesn't hold during cool conditions, but during intense exercise in the heat, you definitely have a big difference in your body temperature when you're hydrated versus dehydrated. So we always try to tell people, to keep their percent dehydration under 2 or 3%. dehydration and come up with a hydration strategy that will allow them to minimize the amount of dehydration. And one way I explain this to people is, if you go in cool conditions, like why the world record in cycling and the marathon, why is the world record always set in 45 or 50 degrees? Because you don't have the stress of the heat. Because you have a finite reservoir of blood in your body. And in cool conditions, it only has to be shared really between the heart and the muscles. Okay. Yeah. And in hot conditions, now we have this massive third reservoir that needs blood, and that's the skin. So now you have the heart, muscle, and skin. So now being divided by 3 is a much different equation than being divided by 2.
Correct.
So it makes it much more harder on the body. But then think of now the other element. If you get dehydrated during activity in the heat, we have a finite reservoir being divided by 3 locations, and now we actually have less fluid. So you can
less plasma volume.
Exactly. Less fluid to be shared amongst those 3 things when you're dehydrated. So that's why you can see hydration really matters during intense exercise in the heat. And additionally, you can see the benefit of heat acclimatization, right? If you have a natural plasma volume expansion before you even go into that exercise session, you have this added advantage versus someone who's not heat acclimatized.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And when you say if you're going to put water over yourself, you want freezing cold water. What about the temperature of the fluid that we consume?
Yeah, I was actually going to get to that. I got sidetracked. That was good. Right. So that's another way of cooling yourself. So obviously, you have to find that sweet spot. Freezing cold fluid to drink, you're then not going to hydrate enough to, get enough fluids in. But there's probably because if it's like 32 degrees, you can't usually pump fluid back as well as like if it's 50 degrees. Because it's just not usually as comfortable for someone to drink really quickly if it's like 32 degrees.
Yeah.
You could test it on yourself or, your brother, each other. Yeah. So, be really dehydrated and take fluid that's 32, 42, 52, 62, and you'll realize that there's a cold fluid, but not necessarily ice cold fluid is a little easier to drink. Okay. So somewhere between 45 and 55, for instance, might be the optimal temperature where you're still cooling down the body from the inside, but you're still able to hydrate at a level that's going to minimize dehydration. Because if we're going to have this discussion, it's always critical to discuss that unfortunately some athletes drink too much. And you may be aware of exertional hyponatremia is always a great fear of anybody in my field of sports science or sports medicine, because just like exertional heat stroke is dangerous, exertional hyponatremia can be very dangerous and actually has obviously killed some endurance athletes because they often will drink on published recommendations or drink, on what they think they should be drinking, but not based on their needs for that day or based on their thirst.
Yeah. What about the color of your clothing? Is obviously with radiation heating, it's known that white clothing is cooler than dark clothing. How important do you think that is? How big of an effect?
Oh, I think it's very important. So I recommend loose fitting clothing, first of all, to have as much wind and air be able to pass. You want to have as much air to pass over as much skin surface area as possible. So I recommend loose fitting clothing, and I recommend light as color as possible, because that's obviously going to be optimal.
For cyclists.
So for you got to think like cyclist aerodynamics is huge, and so
different item.
If we can't go loose fitting, what do you recommend? Like a very breathable fabric, something that's like
something that has some airflow, breathable. Yeah, when I mentioned that just now, I was thinking a little more of like a distance runner not having something skin tight on them.
Yeah,
and even the cyclists not necessarily having something that is ultra compressive kind of on them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, okay. Snug, but not overly tight.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. And then some of these new things out there have some almost like ports that allow air in.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always amazed when you go to Kona, you see people that are, phenomenal athletes, lots of training, lots of intelligence there. And then you'll see them when they come out in dark clothing. And I'm always like, why is this whole field not solid white? I've just never really understood that. But
yes. And that's not, especially there, the dark clothing is very much a bad idea because of the amount of sunshine that you have there.
Yeah, okay, exactly.
All right, so we were kids on a ski hill, and the guy on the ski hills told us that you lose up to 70% of your heat through your head. I don't know if that's true, but I've always wondered, should athletes wear? We're going to go running for a second, and this is primarily focused on cycling. But if an athlete is running, is wearing a hat better to block the sun from your face and your head, or is it more important to let your head breathe?
So that's a great question. I'm going to go back to the very first thing you just said of the person who told you that you lose like 70% of your heat from your head.
Yeah.
That probably emanated from people who have on heavy winter clothing, but they don't have a hat on. And
yes, that was it.
In that case, that might be true, right? Because you're not losing heat through your legs and your chest at that time because you have 3 layers of clothing over your whole body. So the heat that you are losing is probably coming from your head.
It's like a crack in a water vessel. Yeah.
Exactly. But in real life, that's certainly not true. So like if you took a naked body and put them in an exercise session in a heat lab, you're losing the core of your heat, like from where the massive musculature is. So your back and your upper legs, your buttocks, things like that.
Yep.
So, but the second part of what you just said related to the hat, my recommendation on a super sunny day would be to wear like a super light mesh hat to like keep the sun out of your eyes and face.
Okay.
But to still leave as much possible airflow and skin surface area exposed from your head and neck.
So a visor would also work because you have the opening on the visor, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Depending on it. Yeah. If some people who might be bald, like some athletes, are on purpose bald. Yep. And then I would be a little fearful of a 10-hour race and the sun exposure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
okay. So because we talked about convection for cyclists, airflow is key to keeping us cool. So when you're on the flat or you're descending, all the airflow is helping keep you cool, to keep you cool. But when we climb, we slow down a lot. And a lot of times I don't know if you ride a bike, but if it's hot out and you climb and you hit that spot where your speed matches the air speed, it gets really hot right away. Yeah. So if we know, you're doing a big long race and you got a 20-minute climb and we know that we're going to slow down, what tips can you give cyclists, to keep themselves cool during that climb? Is it trying to wet themselves as much as possible before the climb starts? What can they do?
It's a good question. So that would be a time when aerodynamics matters less, right? Because your speed is so slow.
Correct.
So, is your front shirt zippered where you can expose more skin during that time, which would, that might be hugely helpful. And especially if you can wet that skin surface with cold water at that time.
Yep.
Or the arms and necks, arm and neck and things like that, I would think would be helpful. Okay. But I do know exactly what you're talking about. I do a lot of mountain biking, so I don't have quite a long sustained climbs like some of the cyclists have because I've seen them in a lot of different spots.
Yep.
But yeah, that would be my recommendations there.
I'm gunning for Leadville this year, and it gets hot there, and there's some long climbs, so I'm trying to figure out what I should do.
How long will that race take you? How much time?
It's 104 miles, so anywhere. If I'm under 9, I'll be happy. I got to qualify first, so we'll see. But it's probably an 8 to 10 hour race.
Wow. Yep. Yeah, I've been out to Kona 3 times to conduct research studies. So we've worked with some of the elite people there, and we actually have some fascinating studies with pacing, with different pacing strategies on uphills and downhills and how it affected finishing times. Okay.
What about the arm coolers that you see guys wear? They wet the arm cooler, so they basically have a wet arm instead of a skin exposed arm. What do you think of that?
So potential benefit is there for sure. That the thing is as long as that thing that's on their arm can stay cold and stay wet, then I think it's helping them. Okay. If that item becomes dry and now you're limiting skin surface area for convective cooling, I think it could potentially become harmful.
Okay, cool. All right, let's move to hydration. And we covered a little bit of this already, but from what I've read, a lot of people seem to think that your body temperature is too high because you're not drinking enough water. And I think that can be a bit of a misconception. It's not always based on water because, like you said, you can get into hyponatremia. What can you tell us about drinking water, hydration, and body temperature?
So it's similar to what I said before. During intense exercise in the heat, I do think hydration is a really important thing to consider.
Okay.
So if one of those two factors is not present, if it's not intense, which some of your training might not be, or if it is intense, but it's not in the heat, then I don't think it matters as much. Okay. But if you are doing intense exercise in the heat, I think, or your race is going to be in that situation, I think you really need to come up with a strategy to plan ahead, meaning what is your likely sweat losses per unit of time so you can have a strategy and that you can implement the strategy in training before you get to the race. Yeah. So I really, during intense exercise in the heat, hydration is one of the strategies you need to consider for body cooling, mitigation in preparation.
Okay. And then we can drink too much, and that leads to hyponatremia, right? If you drink too much, you're waterlogged, basically.
Without question, yeah.
Okay.
And unfortunately, that could become dangerous, and it certainly will hinder performance.
We'll get into hyponatremia below, so I'll skip this one. John, go ahead and go to the next one.
So if you look at hydration strategy, you said earlier that one of the things you want to do before entering a race is enter fully hydrated. Can you talk a little bit about how do you know if you're fully hydrated, and what would be a plan to do that?
Yeah, so the best thing that we could ever educate athletes is starting to understand first morning measures, to start getting habitual tendencies that they do every day during training, so that will carry over for their race day. And so the first morning measures of urine, thirst, and body weight are extremely valid if you use those three together. And that's what we're trying to train elite athletes to use. So thirst is super simple. There's a validated thirst scales that are like on 1 to 10. There's validated urine color charts, I think, on a scale of like 1 to 8. And then body weight across days, like from one day to the next, a body weight change is very likely to be hydration changes, not, necessarily you lost a bunch of fat, from one day to the next.
Yeah.
So those three in unison are critical for knowing day-to-day hydration. And if you keep doing that, then it's going to be pretty easy to implement on race morning.
Yeah, we actually talked to the guys over at RestWise, and they have the same thing. It's the color of your pee test that tells you your hydration. So that's cool. It's the same thing.
But color of pee is one of the three. It's funny. It's interesting.
Cool you added more.
Yeah, when you do if all three of them give an indication of dehydration, there's like a 99% chance you're dehydrated.
Okay. We talked about during the race. After the race, what do you suggest?
Well, if it's a race you went hard in the heat, I would be very conscientious to trying to restore your hydration within a couple hours of the race, so that your recovery, your quality of your sleep, your body temperature lowering after the race, and your interest in eating, all of those will come back faster if you're not dramatically dehydrated after a race.
But small amounts over a long period of time versus one big slug.
You don't have to take a huge bolus in 10 minutes. But I would say in the 2 to 3 hours following a race, you should conscientiously be looking to try to overcome your dehydration.
Okay. What about electrolyte replacement? Any tricks for that or tips for that during?
Are we talking about before, during, or after?
Just let's say during. So obviously there's mixtures. How are you looking at it from a replacement? Are you some of the testing that you said before that you've done where you can do sweat tests and certain things like that? Are you combining that with the electrolytes that people are taking in the race?
Oh yeah. We look at the particular items that they traditionally use, and then we compare it to what our testing has found to be their sweat loss per unit of, their electrolyte loss per unit of time, and then we help them find the right amount of the item that they're used to taking to replace. And sodium
what about before and after? Are you preloading before?
Well, I'll finish with the during just for one sec with this sodium. Sodium has a lot of benefits that people sometimes overlook. We're not necessarily taking sodium in to overcome some big deficit in the body. One of the other benefits of sodium, for instance, is it keeps the thirst mechanism on longer, which helps you minimize dehydration. Second is it often makes the fluid a little bit more palatable if it has a little bit of sodium in it versus just having pure water for 9 straight hours. And then third, it helps with fluid retention. You actually have a lower percentage of your fluid becomes urine if you have some sodium in the fluid that you're ingesting. So you just become a little bit more of an efficient hydrator.
Okay.
And then before and after, what are you looking at?
So before, I don't necessarily, anybody who has a good diet, like a normal diet, I don't think you necessarily need to load up on it at all, because you're just going to secrete out any extras anyway. Mm-hmm. Unless someone has, someone might have specific medical conditions that would be beyond my pay grade that they might have to consult, for things related to that. But I'd say for the normal endurance athlete, as long as they have a good diet and they have a normal ingestion, I think they're okay. For after, the same things come into play. Having sodium in your rehydration after is very important, because it allows you to rehydrate faster, because like I just said, it really enhances fluid retention, so less of that fluid that you're drinking becomes urine.
Okay. And what about nutrition in the heat? As it gets hotter, do we slow down our digestion, increase our digestion?
Yes.
How does that work?
No, it actually becomes a lot harder to renourish. The reason is that the hotter it is, remember, it gets back to that equation. the hotter the exercise, the less blood flow going to the stomach and the
Right.
intestines because it's being shunted to these three other sources.
And
Right.
So it's much harder to handle food in the heat.
But that's ultimately related to the individual's core body temperature, not necessarily the exterior temperature. So somebody who is overheating versus somebody who's not in the same temperature will digest at a slower rate.
Well, yeah, what I'm saying is I'm comparing one person against themselves. So if you did you were exercised in 95-degree temperature versus 45-degree temperature, there's going to be way more blood flow going to your stomach in 45-degree temperature, which is going to way more increase the comfort level of eating something.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk about pre-cooling. You see athletes wearing ice vests before races in hot conditions. Does that work?
Oh, absolutely. Body cooling is a very underutilized strategy for enhancing athletic performance. We completed a systematic review looking at all the body cooling studies in endurance athletes, and we found about a 4% improvement in performance with body cooling strategies.
4%?
Yes.
Wow.
So very underutilized. It's completely legal, like it's a legal ergogenic aid. So the pre-cooling, it depends on the circumstance that you're in. Like, does a triathlete need to pre-cool? Absolutely not, because they're going into the water to start the activity.
Okay.
So, and then if you were doing like your Leadville race, no help there because you're a 9-hour race. So the pre-cooling is going to help you for the first 30 or 40 minutes, and then that was a waste of time.
Yeah.
So there's sweet spots that it would help. Like if you had a
time
road,
trials.
If you had things that last like 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours, it probably could help. Certainly runners, like a 10K race on the track, maybe even a marathon in really hot conditions, because that's going to help them in that first 30 or 40 minutes of the activity. But it wears off after that initial time.
Okay. And what's the best strategy for doing it?
Okay, so it's good. It depends on how extensive your warm-up needs to be, right? So some sports where you have to use the item while you're warming up. So they have really good cooling vests nowadays that are much improved so that you can still get a quality warm-up in without your body temperature going up. Okay. So you might be able to start the activity at 99 or 100, whereas if you didn't have the vest on, you might be 102. So we always recommend that you decrease your warm-up in the heat anyway compared to normal, because there's no need to overheat or get too tired before you start. But that's cooling vest is a very good option as an example.
Okay. All right. Let's, we got about 10 minutes of your time left. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a little bit less. I do have to hop on so I'd just say like 7 or 8 minutes.
Okay. So we're going to rapid fire. Okay. Yeah. So we just did hot. Let's go to cold really, really quick. What's the best strategy for keeping, warm in the cold? Is it clothing?
Yeah, so it takes us to the opposite of what we just said before, is now you want to cover as much of the skin surface area as possible.
Okay.
Because you want to minimize that exposure. So having your first layer of clothing on all your body being very tight to the skin so that you're minimizing airflow over skin surface.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Should we wear certain colors to keep us warm? Do we go to dark colors?
Dark would help. It probably would only have an effect on a really bright sunny day in the cold.
Yep.
But for most of the times, I don't know how much of an effect it would have.
Do smaller athletes have a harder time staying warm?
I actually am. I'm going to be honest with you here. I'm actually not 100% sure. My expertise is more about exercise in the heat, so I don't want to overstep into saying something. That's actually a good question.
Okay.
Yep. Should our hydration strategy stay the same in the cold?
Okay, so we definitely have to consume way less fluids. Our sweat rates are way lower. We do lose a little more sometimes via respiration in the cold because the air being dry. But people should still be aware of their hydration is, right? Because if you have something that lasts 5 or 6 hours, you still have to be aware of it. You're just going to need to drink less.
Okay. And I'm guessing we eat more in the cold as well.
Yeah. So we're usually more comfortably can eat in the cold because we don't have that, shunting of blood away from our stomach and intestines.
Okay. So we know that acclimatization works in the heat. What is the best strategy for doing it? Sure.
Yeah. So the recommendation we tell people is you want to have, there's obviously a range, pro athlete versus a novice athlete. A pro athlete, if their career is hinging on this, you really could take 20 days to fully heat acclimatize before an event.
Okay.
But a novice athlete who still cares seriously about an event could get a ton of benefits from just 4 or 5 heat exercise sessions.
Okay.
So a big part of the curve, like 80 to 90% of the heat acclimatization benefits happen in the first week. So we're talking about, can you have 4, 5, 6 heat exposures in that first week? And when we say heat exposure, we're looking at basically to see your body temperature get over 102 for about 60 to 90 minutes of time.
Okay.
That's what we consider like a session. And just, we have athletes, high level athletes, they can create their own heat lab in their own house. They just take a small room, put their cycle trainer in it, and buy a couple space heaters, and you can have a 90-degree room in your own house.
Okay. What type of performance effect does that have on performance?
Oh, it's much bigger than people realize because of the physiological benefits I mentioned to you earlier. You probably, if you did the same exact thing in the heat versus not, I would wager to bet at least 5 to 7% performance benefit for someone heat acclimatized versus not.
Oh, 5 to 7.
Oh, wow. For sure. It could even be more depending on what kind of event we're talking about.
Okay. And just since cold isn't your topic, I know, but does acclimatization work in the cold or not?
It does. There is some new research showing that, the exposure to cold before you have to perform in the cold certainly could benefit somebody. And that's kind of an evolving area of research, but it's exciting to watch.
Okay.
What's the best way to acclimatize in the cold?
Well, kind of the same thing.
Same thing.
I mean, what is your event going to be? So it's, I'm not exactly sure, like in terms of if your body temperature actually needs to change, or if it's more like exposing the skin or your body to that cold.
Yep.
I would consult with like a John Castellani, who's the military cold physiologist, who would be a great resource for that.
Okay, cool. Since we have 3 minutes, we're going to lump these. I was going to go a little bit more into detail, but basically, I think some of them you've written a lot on keeping people safe. You have books on the topic. So heat stroke, hypothermia, and hyponatremia seem to be the risks that athletes are at for sudden death. Let's start with heat stroke really quick. What are some signs and symptoms of that? If we see them, how can we help somebody?
Sure. So the biggest warning signs for an exertional heat stroke is someone having CNS changes, so central nervous system changes. So they might start acting loopy, or they don't interact with you as they normally would. They're very slow to respond. They might be agitated, potentially even combative. Those are some things that are definitely warning signs that they could be having an exertional heat stroke. Other more mild things that are early warning signs might be like extreme nausea, vomiting, and dizziness, and just extreme fatigue, and feeling uncomfortable in the heat.
Okay. And then what can we do to help them? If let's say we're out on a training day and you see that, what do we do?
Oh, if you ever really think someone's is overheating, have a heat stroke, the key to survival is minimizing the amount of time they're hyperthermic. If you can keep the amount of time to under 30 minutes that they're over 104 degrees, that survival rate has been 100%. So that's why triathlon races, cycling races, and running races, and high school, college, and pro football programs all have immersion tubs set up at medical tents right near the facility so that we can cool them on site quickly.
So get them out of the hot and cover them in
cool
water.
Them as fast as humanly possible. And even if the tub's not right there, put freezing cold wet towels on them and get them to the tub.
Okay. Hypothermia. What are similar signs and symptoms, right? Kind of delusional.
Yep. Yeah. So thankfully with hypothermia, it takes a lot more time to have dangerous ramifications. But the key with hypothermia is obviously getting them out of the cold, get off their cold, wet clothing, put warm clothing on them, cover skin surface area, and try to obviously rewarm them.
Okay, are wet clothes better than no clothes?
Say it again?
Are wet clothes better than no clothes?
I would say no for a person who's hypothermic, because and then the best thing would be to hug them, or surround them with yourself or other people that you can that would be warm and dry.
Okay, perfect. Last two questions. Hyponatremia. What are the signs and symptoms of that, and how do you help that?
So early warning signs could be things like people feel like swelling in their hands, or their shoes feel really tight, or their watch feels really tight. They could have central nervous system dysfunction, meaning they could have extreme headaches, or potentially have something more than that. But the biggest thing with that is early on, if you notice something, ask them. And I'll work medical tents, and we'll ask them, and they'll say, "Oh, I stopped at every aid station. I drank as much as possible." And now you're starting to think, well, this might be a hyponatremia. It might not be a heat stroke. And we'll get a core body temperature reading right away. And if it's super high, obviously we're thinking heat stroke. And if it's not high and they have these CNS dysfunctions, obviously we're starting to think hyponatremia, and we'll get a blood sodium level with a finger prick, and then help them out.
And then you give them sodium?
we do something called hypertonic saline, which is a
Okay.
super high dose amount of sodium and a very small amount of fluid.
All right, last question. We ask every guest this. The idea is you have a cyclist with a 300 watt FTP. If they take all of the advice from the expert on the show, how many watts is that worth? So someone is acclimatized, they have a good strategy, they keep their body temperature within range. How many watts is that worth on a race?
Wow. I'm not sure if I could put it into watts with combining all of these at the same time.
How about percentage?
Yeah, I'm going to say that. I think percent would be a little easier. If you did all of these things, I would have to put it somewhere around 5%, 5-6%. I would think if they were all done optimally and they did enough of it in training so that it's natural in the race.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I know you're on for time. I can't thank you enough for being on the show. The best way to get in touch with you or learn more about your books is on Amazon, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Or go to the Corey Stringer Institute website, where we have a lot of good resources for people, and that's ksi.uconn.edu.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy your Christmas holidays, and we can't thank you enough. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 20, where we interview urologist Dr. Joseph Candela and discuss how saddle selection, urogenital health, and healthy levels of testosterone can help you become a faster cyclist. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flowcycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.